The morning James Hartford decided to abandon his farm in Ohio, frost still clung to the fields like a stubborn promise of winter's return. He stood at the edge of his property, looking out over 40 acres that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him, and felt nothing but a suffocating weight pressing down on his chest. The soil here was tired. The yields had been declining for 3 years running, and the debt collectors were circling like vultures over a dying animal. Then there was Margaret, buried under the oak tree by the creek, taken by fever the previous spring along with their infant son. Every furrow in this earth reminded him of what he'd lost. The newspaper sat folded in his coat pocket, ink still fresh on the pages. The headline screamed in bold type about gold discovered in California, about fortunes being made by common men, about a land where opportunity flowed as freely as the rivers supposedly did with golden nuggets. James knew it was probably exaggerated. He'd lived long enough to recognize the smell of hype and speculation. But what did he have to lose? A failing farm and a town full of memories that cut him every time he walked down the street. He sold everything he could at a loss, packed what remained into 2 canvas bags, and bought passage on a wagon train heading west. The journey would take months, possibly half a year, depending on weather and circumstances. James joined up with a company of 43 souls assembling in Independence, Missouri, the great jumping-off point where civilization ended and the frontier began. The group included families with wide-eyed children who thought this was some grand adventure, grizzled men who'd been west before and knew better than to romanticize it, young bachelors like himself fleeing various disappointments, and even 2 women traveling unchaperoned, which caused considerable consternation among the more conservative members of the party. The wagon master, a leathery man named Cyrus Blackwell, who'd made this journey 5 times already, gathered everyone in a circle before departure. He spoke plainly, without embellishment or false hope. Half of them wouldn't make it to California, he said. Not because they'd die necessarily, though some would, but because they'd turn back when they realized what they'd gotten themselves into. The trail was 2,000 miles of dust, disease, drowning, Indians who might be hostile or might be indifferent, but were definitely being displaced by this endless stream of white faces pushing west, and terrain that ranged from monotonous plains to mountain passes that would test both their wagons and their faith in God. James listened to this recitation of horrors and felt oddly comforted. At least someone was being honest. The newspapers back east had made it sound like a pleasure cruise with gold nuggets waiting at the end. Blackwell's assessment matched reality better, and James had developed a deep suspicion of easy promises and guaranteed fortunes. They departed on April 15th, 1849, part of the massive exodus that would later be called the 49ers. Tens of thousands were making this same journey that year, either overland like James or by sea around Cape Horn, or across the Isthmus of Panama. It was a migration unlike anything America had seen before. A sudden mass movement of humanity, all chasing the same glittering dream. The parallel to what would happen 150 years later with Silicon Valley and the dot-com boom was almost eerie. Both were driven by the same fundamental human drives: greed, hope, desperation, and the eternal belief that somewhere else, somehow, you could reinvent yourself and strike it rich. The first weeks on the trail were almost pleasant. Spring was emerging across the prairie, wildflowers blooming in vast carpets of color, buffalo herds moving like brown oceans across the grasslands. The company fell into a routine. Rise before dawn, coffee and cornmeal mush, hitch the oxen, and start moving. They averaged 12 to 15 miles a day when conditions were good. At night, they'd circle the wagons more out of tradition than necessity, since Indian attacks were actually quite rare, despite the lurid stories back east, and people would sit around fires telling stories, playing fiddles, occasionally breaking into spontaneous dances that seemed absurd out here in the middle of nowhere. James befriended a man named Thomas Wu, one of the few Chinese immigrants in the wagon train. Thomas had come to America 3 years prior, working as a laborer in San Francisco before the gold discovery, and was now returning after a brief visit to family connections in New York. He spoke English with a thick accent, but was quick with a smile and had a dry wit that James appreciated. Thomas warned him that the Chinese were facing increasing hostility in California as more arrived, drawn by news of gold that had reached even distant Chinese ports. The Americans didn't like competition, he explained, especially from people who looked different and were willing to work harder for less. This should have been James's first real indication of what awaited in California. The gold rush wasn't just about mining. It was about a complete social upheaval, a collision of cultures and classes and ambitions in a place where the normal rules hadn't yet been established. It was chaos masquerading as opportunity, which is exactly what every speculative bubble is at its core. Whether it's gold or stocks or cryptocurrency or internet companies, the fundamental dynamic remains the same. A rush of people convinced they've found the secret to easy wealth, most of whom will be disappointed. By the time they reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, reality had started setting in for the wagon train. 3 people had died, 2 from cholera, and 1 from an accidental gunshot wound. 5 families had turned back, deciding the risk wasn't worth whatever reward might await. The oxen were showing strain, and everyone was perpetually covered in dust that seemed to permeate everything, getting into food, water, and lungs. The romantic notion of westward expansion had given way to the grinding reality of just trying to survive each day. The mountains were worse. Crossing the Rockies meant navigating passes where a single mistake could send a wagon tumbling down a ravine. They had to double up teams of oxen to pull wagons up impossible grades, then carefully brake them going down the other side. Tools broke, axles cracked, people got injured, tempers frayed as exhaustion and fear took their toll. James witnessed 2 men nearly kill each other over a disagreement about whether to rest the animals or push forward, a conflict that would have seemed trivial back in civilization, but out here could literally mean the difference between life and death. Thomas proved invaluable during this stretch. He had a gift for mechanics, fixing wagons with makeshift repairs that somehow held together. He also taught James some basic Cantonese phrases during the long walking hours, though James's pronunciation was apparently atrocious and caused Thomas great amusement. They talked about what they'd do once they reached California. Thomas planned to mine for a few years, save every penny, and eventually open a general store. He'd seen enough of life to know that the real money was in serving the miners, not in mining itself. James was still caught up in the dream of striking it rich personally, though doubt was starting to creep in around the edges of his conviction. The desert crossing nearly broke them all. Water became more precious than gold would ever be. They travelled at night when possible to escape the brutal heat, and even then, people collapsed from exhaustion. James helped bury a child who didn't survive the journey, standing in the scorching sun while the mother wailed and the father stood silent, face carved from stone. What kind of opportunity was worth this? What kind of gold justified these graves scattered across the wilderness? But they pressed on because what else could they do? Turning back meant admitting defeat, wasting months of travel, losing the investments they'd made in equipment and supplies. This is another hallmark of bubbles. Once you're in, it becomes psychologically almost impossible to get out. You've committed so much already, invested so much hope and money and identity into the venture, that abandoning it feels like a form of suicide. So you keep going, keep believing, keep telling yourself that just around the next bend, over the next ridge, the payoff will finally materialize. When they finally crossed into California and saw the Sierra Nevada mountains rising before them, James felt a complex mixture of relief and dread. They'd made it this far. The worst should be behind them. But he'd heard stories about the Donner Party just 3 years earlier, trapped in these mountains by early snow, reduced to cannibalism to survive. The mountains looked beautiful and terrible, a final barrier between them and their dreams. The descent from the Sierras into the California valleys was almost surreal after months of harsh terrain. Suddenly, everything was green and lush, trees heavy with fruit, rivers running clear and cold. It seemed like paradise after the hell of the journey. James understood why emigrants called it the Promised Land. But he also noticed something else. The landscape was already scarred. Mining operations had torn into hillsides, rivers ran muddy with sediment, forests had been clear-cut for lumber. The gold rush had only been going for a year, and already the environmental damage was visible from miles away. They arrived in Sacramento in September, 5 months after leaving Missouri. The city shouldn't have existed. A year earlier, it had been basically nothing, a small settlement at the confluence of rivers. Now it was a chaotic boomtown of 10,000 people living in tents, wooden shacks, and a few hastily constructed buildings that optimistically called themselves hotels. The streets were rivers of mud, garbage piled everywhere, and the noise was overwhelming. Hammering, sawing, shouting, wagons creaking, animals braying, all of it blending into a constant roar of commerce and construction. James stood at the edge of Sacramento, bags in hand, and realized he had no idea what to do next. The wagon train was disbanding, everyone going their separate ways to pursue their individual fortunes. Thomas clasped his hand and said they should meet up in a month to compare notes. James agreed, though he had no idea where he'd be in a month, or if he'd even still be alive. The mortality rate in the mining camps was staggering, though nobody advertised that in the newspapers. The first thing James needed was information. Where were the good claims? What equipment did he actually need? How did the whole system work? He made his way to a saloon that was really just a large tent with a plank bar, ordered whiskey that cost 10 times what it would back in Ohio, and started listening. This was a crucial education that every new arrival had to go through, learning the actual reality of gold mining versus the fantasy they'd been sold. An old-timer named Dutch Pete, face weathered, like old leather and missing several teeth, took pity on James's obvious greenhorn status and started explaining the facts of life. First, all the easy gold was already claimed. Those first few months in 1848, when you could literally pick up nuggets from streams, were long gone. Now you needed to work claims that had already been picked over, or try to buy into existing operations, or head further into the mountains where the terrain was more difficult, but the streams less crowded. Second, mining wasn't romantic. It was brutal, back-breaking labor done in cold water, bent over for hours at a time, sifting through endless gravel for tiny specks of gold that might add up to a few dollars a day if you were lucky, or nothing at all if you weren't. The average miner made barely enough to cover his expenses, which were astronomical because everything in California cost 10 times its normal price. A loaf of bread was 50 cents, a pound of coffee was $2, a simple cotton shirt was $5. The merchants were the ones getting rich, not the miners. Third, and Dutch Pete really emphasized this, most miners went broke or died. Disease was rampant in the camps. Cholera, dysentery, scurvy, typhoid, all flourished in the unsanitary conditions. Violence was common. Disputes over claims led to shootings, and law enforcement was essentially non-existent outside the main towns. Justice was administered by miners' courts that could be fair-minded or bloodthirsty, depending on who showed up and what mood they were in. James listened to all this and felt his dreams crumbling. He'd come all this way, survived the trail, invested everything he had, and now he was learning that he'd bought into a scam. Not an intentional scam necessarily, but a collective delusion that had gripped the nation. This was the California gold rush stripped of its mythology, a speculative bubble fueled by impossible hopes and facilitated by newspapers and politicians who had incentives to keep the hype machine running. But what choice did he have now? He couldn't go back. He'd burned that bridge literally and figuratively, so he did what millions of people do when they realize they've bought into a bubble at the wrong time. He kept going, hoping against hope that maybe he'd be one of the lucky ones, that maybe the statistics wouldn't apply to him, that maybe there was still gold enough for one more dreamer. James spent his remaining money on basic mining equipment: a pan, a pick, a shovel, a cradle rocker for sifting larger quantities of gravel. He bought supplies that would last a month if he was careful. Then he joined a group of men heading up to the American River, where rumors said there were still decent claims available for latecomers. The group included 2 brothers from Vermont, a former sailor from New Bedford, a German immigrant whose English was almost non-existent, and a black man named Samuel who'd been born free in Pennsylvania and come west looking for opportunity in a place where maybe skin color mattered less than it did back east. He would be disappointed. They traveled for 3 days along trails that were rutted from thousands of wagon wheels, passing camps and mining operations of every size and description. Some were just single men with pans working creek beds. Others were elaborate affairs with wooden sluices, water wheels, and teams of workers organized like little companies. The inequality was already visible. Those who'd arrived early and staked good claims were making money. Those who came later were fighting over scraps. The group finally staked claims along a stretch of river that looked promising, but probably wasn't. The geography was good, a bend in the river where heavy materials like gold would theoretically settle, but the gravel bars had already been worked over multiple times. Still, what else were they going to do? They set up camp in a grove of oak trees, built rough shelters from branches and canvas, and prepared to start mining. The first morning, James waded into water so cold it made his legs ache within minutes. He filled his pan with gravel from the riverbed, then began the process he'd been shown in Sacramento, swirling the pan to wash away lighter materials, while hoping heavier gold would settle to the bottom. It was monotonous work that required concentration. Too aggressive and you'd wash away any gold. Too gentle and you'd take forever to process each pan. He worked for 3 hours before seeing his first colour, a tiny speck of gold no bigger than a pinhead stuck to the bottom of his pan. His heart leapt at the sight, even though intellectually he knew that single speck was worthless. The technique of panning required a specific rhythm that took days to master. You'd fill the pan about 3/4 full with gravel and sediment from the riverbed, then submerge it completely in water. The next step was to shake it vigorously side to side, which allowed the heavier materials, hopefully including gold, to settle to the bottom, while lighter materials rose to the top. Then came the delicate part, tilting the pan slightly and using a gentle circular motion to wash the lighter materials over the edge, all while keeping the pan mostly submerged to prevent losing any gold. This process repeated dozens of times for each pan until only a small amount of heavy black sand remained at the bottom. If you were lucky, you'd see the distinctive yellow gleam of gold among the dark sand. The physical toll was immediate and severe. Standing bent over in icy water for hours created back pain that never fully went away. The cold water caused a condition miners called miner's rheumatism, where joints would swell and ache, making movement difficult. Hands became raw and cracked from constant immersion in cold water and the abrasive action of gravel. Many miners developed a distinctive shuffle in their walk from the constant stooping. James noticed that older miners, those who'd been at it for months or years, often couldn't straighten up fully, even when not in the water. By the end of that first day, James had processed maybe 50 pans and found gold dust that probably amounted to $1 worth. Considering that his daily expenses were running close to $3 just for food and basic supplies, he'd lost money. And his back was screaming, his hands were raw, and he was so exhausted he could barely eat the beans and hardtack that constituted dinner before collapsing into sleep. The second day was worse. His body, unused to this particular type of labour, had stiffened overnight. Every movement sent sharp pains through his back and legs. His hands were so raw that gripping the pan edge was agonising, but he had no choice but to continue. This was what he'd come to California for, what he'd invested everything in. Quitting after one day wasn't an option, so he gritted his teeth and waded back into the frigid stream. The learning curve was steep. James gradually improved his technique, learning to read the riverbed better, to identify likely spots where gold might accumulate. He learned that gold, being much heavier than other materials, would settle in certain predictable locations, behind large rocks where the current slowed, in the inside bends of streams, in cracks and crevices of the bedrock. He learned to look for what miners called colour signs, subtle indicators that gold might be present in workable quantities. After a week, James moved beyond simple panning to using a rocker, also called a cradle, which allowed for processing much larger volumes of gravel. The rocker was essentially a wooden box mounted on curved runners that allowed it to rock back and forth. The miner would shovel gravel into the top while another person, or the same person alternating tasks, would rock it while pouring water through. The rocking motion, combined with the water flow, would separate lighter materials from heavier ones, with gold hopefully collecting in riffles at the bottom. Using a rocker was more efficient than panning, but required either partnership or exhausting solo effort. James paired up with one of the Vermont brothers, alternating between shoveling and rocking. This doubled their daily output, but also doubled the labour intensity. They'd work in shifts, 2 hours shoveling while the other rocked, then switch. By the end of a day, both men were completely spent, having moved literal tons of gravel through the rocker. The rocker yielded better returns than panning alone, but still not enough to be truly profitable. On a good day, the two men might recover $3 or $4 worth of gold between them. Split 2 ways, and after expenses, they were barely breaking even. On bad days, they might find nothing, which meant going deeper into debt or eating into their reserves. The variance was psychologically brutal. You could work all day with nothing to show for it, then find a nugget the next day that covered a week's expenses. This intermittent reinforcement, exactly like gambling, kept people hooked even when the overall economics didn't make sense. Some miners moved to even more sophisticated equipment. The long tom was an extended sluice, essentially a long trough with riffles that could process even more gravel than a rocker. It required at least 3 men to operate efficiently and a steady source of running water. One man would shovel gravel into the top, another would break up larger clumps and remove rocks, and a third would manage the water flow. Groups of miners would form partnerships to operate, long toms, splitting the proceeds according to their shares in the operation. These partnerships often ended in bitter disputes. Arguments over who was working harder, who deserved bigger shares, whether to keep working a claim that wasn't yielding or move elsewhere, could tear groups apart. James watched several partnerships dissolve into fistfights or worse. The stress of hard labor, combined with economic pressure and close quarters, brought out the worst in people. Trust was a rare commodity in the mining camps. The most advanced technique James encountered during his mining days was hydraulic mining, though he never worked in such an operation himself. Hydraulic mining used water under high pressure, delivered through canvas hoses or metal pipes, to literally blast hillsides apart. The water jets were powerful enough to knock a man down or even kill him if he got in the way. Entire hillsides would be washed away, exposing the gold-bearing gravel underneath, which would then be run through massive sluices. Hydraulic mining was devastatingly effective at extracting gold, but required substantial capital investment in water rights, piping, and infrastructure. It was the domain of companies, not individual miners. It also caused catastrophic environmental damage, washing millions of tons of sediment into rivers and streams, burying farmland downstream, causing floods, and fundamentally altering the landscape in ways that persisted for generations. James visited one hydraulic operation while making deliveries, and was both awed and horrified by what he saw. A crew of men stood on platforms directing massive water jets at a cliff face. The water hit with such force that it carved away the hillside like a knife through butter. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of water and collapsing earth. The runoff was a muddy torrent carrying away everything it touched, turning the once clear stream into a brown soup that flowed down to the valleys below. The supervisor of the operation, a former engineer from Pennsylvania, explained the economics with evident pride. A hydraulic operation could process in a day what would take hundreds of men with pans a month to process. The initial investment was substantial, perhaps $50,000 for a good setup, but the returns could be enormous if the deposit was rich. The company he worked for was clearing $20,000 a month in profit, which would repay their initial investment in just a few months and make them wealthy men within a year. But James noticed something the supervisor didn't mention or didn't care about. The destruction was permanent. The hillside being blasted away would never recover. The sediment being washed into the streams would cause problems for decades. The mercury being used to separate gold from the processed gravel was poisoning the water that people downstream depended on for drinking and irrigation. This operation was making a few men rich while externalizing massive costs onto everyone else and onto future generations. This was the dark heart of the gold rush economy and of every extractive bubble. Those doing the extracting captured the benefits, while the costs were spread across society and the environment. The hydraulic mining company's profits showed up on their balance sheets as success. The destroyed landscapes, poisoned waters, and displaced communities didn't show up anywhere in their accounting. This remains the fundamental problem with boom economies. They measure the gains, but ignore the losses, creating an illusion of wealth creation that's actually just wealth and value transfer. James's time as a miner lasted only 2 months before he had to admit defeat. He'd lost weight, gained nothing but debt and pain, and come to understand that the gold rush mythology was a lie for most participants. The stories of men picking up nuggets from streams belong to the first few months of 1848. By late 49, those days were ancient history. What remained was brutal labour for minimal returns, and James had no desire to continue pursuing something that clearly wasn't working. But those 2 months taught him invaluable lessons about the reality of mining, the psychology of speculation, and the difference between mythology and truth. These lessons would serve him well in his subsequent business ventures, and in life generally. He learned that hard work alone wasn't enough if you were working the wrong thing. He learned that being early mattered enormously in any rush or boom. He learned that the real money was in serving the rushers, not joining them. And he learned that when something seems too good to be true, it probably is, no matter how many other people believe in it. This became the routine. Wake before dawn, work the river until your body couldn't take any more, return to camp to eat and rest, then do it all again the next day. The monotony was punctuated by occasional excitement when someone in the group found a decent nugget, but mostly it was just grinding, exhausting labour for minimal return. James began to understand why so many miners were giving up and either heading home or transitioning into other work. The daily routine in the mining camps followed a relentless rhythm dictated by daylight and physical endurance. Miners would rise at first light, sometimes earlier during summer when the days were longer, and every hour of daylight meant more gravel processed. There was no gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness. You simply opened your eyes, felt the aches from yesterday's labour, and forced yourself to move because the alternative was starvation or abandoning your claim to someone else. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was typically hardtack and coffee. Hardtack was a thick, dry biscuit that could last indefinitely without spoiling, but had the texture and taste of slightly salty cardboard. Miners would often soften it in their coffee to make it marginally more palatable. The coffee was usually made by boiling water in whatever pot or pan was available and throwing in coarse grounds, which meant drinking it carefully to avoid getting a mouthful of bitter sediment. On good days, there might be bacon or salt pork to go with the hardtack. On bad days, it was just the hardtack and coffee, which barely provided enough calories for the punishing physical labour ahead. The walk to the claim in the morning was one of the few peaceful moments in a miner's day. The gold country in early morning had a strange beauty, with mist rising from the rivers and the low sun filtering through pine trees. Birds sang, deer occasionally appeared at the edge of clearings, and for a brief moment you could almost forget the misery that awaited. But that moment passed quickly as you reached your claim and saw the same patch of riverbed or hillside you'd been working for days or weeks, knowing it held maybe a few dollars worth of gold if you were lucky and nothing if you weren't. Work consumed the middle of the day. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose, the physical demands became even more brutal. Miners working in streams at least had the cold water to provide some relief from the heat, though that same cold water was also slowly destroying their health. Those working dry diggings, using rockers or long toms away from flowing water and hauling water in buckets, faced the full force of the California sun beating down on them hour after hour. The heat could be dangerous. Miners would sometimes collapse from heat exhaustion or sunstroke, lying in whatever shade they could find until they recovered or didn't. There was no medical care available in most camps beyond whatever folk remedies other miners might know. If you got seriously ill or injured, your options were to tough it out, Have someone haul you to Sacramento or San Francisco, where doctors existed but charged astronomical fees, or die. Many chose the third option involuntarily. Lunch was usually a brief affair taken in the middle of the day, often just more hardtack and water, maybe some jerky if you had it. Miners learned to eat quickly and get back to work, because every minute not mining was a minute someone else might be finding gold. The competitive pressure was constant. If your neighbor found a nugget, you felt compelled to work even harder, convinced that your own fortune was just one more pan away. This psychology drove miners to work themselves to the point of collapse. The afternoons stretched on endlessly. Your back would be screaming, your hands would be raw and possibly bleeding, your legs would be cramping from the cold water or from standing hunched over for hours. But you'd keep going because what else could you do? You'd invested everything to get here. Quitting meant admitting failure. Continuing meant hope, however slim, that tomorrow would be better than today. So you filled another pan, rocked another load of gravel, shoveled another pile of dirt, in an endless cycle that ground men down to their essential elements. Evening brought a kind of relief, but not rest. As the sun sank toward the horizon and shadows lengthened across the diggings, miners would finally abandon their claims and trudge back to camp. The walk back was noticeably different from the morning journey. Men moved slower, bodies exhausted, faces set in grim lines. There was little conversation. Everyone was too tired and too focused on just getting back to camp, getting some food, and collapsing into sleep. Dinner was the main meal of the day, though calling it a meal was generous. The standard fare was beans cooked in a pot over an open fire, maybe with some salt pork or bacon mixed in for flavour and fat. The beans were often undercooked because miners were too tired to tend them properly or simply didn't have enough fuel to maintain a hot fire long enough. You'd eat them anyway, scooping them up with pieces of hardtack or just using a spoon, getting the calories you needed, even if the taste left much to be desired. Some miners tried to improve their diet by hunting or fishing, but this required time and energy that most didn't have. After a full day of mining, the last thing you wanted to do was go hunting. And fishing in streams that had been churned up by mining operations rarely yielded much. The fish, like everything else in the gold country, had been negatively impacted by the massive human invasion and the environmental destruction it caused. The camps themselves were studies in temporary living. Shelters ranged from simple canvas tents to more elaborate structures made from logs and boards, depending on how long miners planned to stay in one spot and how much effort they were willing to invest in construction versus mining. Most miners opted for the minimum shelter necessary to keep rain off, reasoning that building a fancy cabin was wasted effort when you might abandon the claim and move on at any time. James's shelter was typical, a canvas tent about 10 feet square, staked to the ground and supported by a central pole. Inside was his bedroll, a few personal items in a wooden crate, his mining tools when not in use, and whatever food supplies he had on hand. The tent provided minimal protection from the elements. It kept rain off mostly, though water would often seep in through the ground during heavy storms. It provided no insulation, so summer days were sweltering inside the tent, and winter nights were freezing. It was shelter in the most technical sense, but not what anyone would consider comfortable. The spatial organization of mining camps reflected both practical necessities and social hierarchies. Camps would typically develop along water sources, with the best claims closest to the water and subsequent arrivals forced to work areas further away or less promising. The main camp area, where shelters were clustered, would often be on higher ground away from the stream, itself, providing protection from flooding while still being close enough to the claims for convenience. Within the camp, there was a rough social organization. Men from the same region or background would cluster together. You'd have groups of Americans from various states, separate groups of Chinese miners, Chilean and Mexican miners, often keeping to themselves, and Europeans forming their own subgroups. This segregation was partly about comfort and communication, but also reflected the racial tensions that pervaded the camps. The center of camp activity was usually the campfire area, where men would gather in the evening after the day's work. This was where news was shared, stories were told, disputes were arbitrated, and the minimal social life of the camp took place. On Saturday evenings, when miners typically took Sunday off from active mining, the campfire gatherings could become quite lively, with drinking, gambling, music, and storytelling continuing late into the night. Gambling was ubiquitous in the camps. Men who'd worked all week for a few dollars in gold dust would bet it all on cards, dice, or whatever other games were available. This made no economic sense, but perfect psychological sense. The miners' lives were already gambles, stakes placed on hopes of striking it rich. Betting your earnings on cards was just a more immediate version of the same gamble. And gambling offered a sense of control and excitement that was absent from the grinding monotony of mining work. Card games ranged from simple games like poker and blackjack to more elaborate affairs. The stakes could be gold dust, which was treated as currency in the camps, or sometimes claims themselves. More than one miner lost his claim in a poker game, which could lead to bitter disputes about whether gambling debts should be honored. The miners' courts generally enforced such debts if both parties had been sober at the time of the bet, but there was considerable room for dispute and manipulation. Fighting was common, fueled by alcohol, exhaustion, frustration, and the close quarters of camp life. Minor disputes could escalate into brawls that drew in multiple participants. More serious conflicts could lead to duels, though these were less common than popular imagination suggests. Most fights were drunken scuffles that left everyone with black eyes and hangovers, but no lasting damage. But some fights did turn deadly, with men pulling knives or guns over perceived slights or actual grievances. The miners' courts were the primary form of justice in the camps, though calling them courts was generous. When a serious dispute arose or a crime was committed, the camp would assemble and elect a judge from among their number, usually someone with education or legal background if such a person was available. Lawyers, if present, would represent the parties. Everyone in camp could participate in the trial, asking questions and ultimately voting on the verdict. These courts could be fair-minded and thoughtful, carefully weighing evidence and testimony before reaching a verdict. Or they could be mob justice, with outcomes predetermined by prejudice and passion rather than facts. The quality of justice you received depended largely on who you were accused by, and the mood of the crowd that day. If you were an unpopular outsider, accused by a well-liked member of the community, your prospects were grim, regardless of actual innocence. Punishments handed down by miners' courts were swift and often harsh. For theft, which was considered one of the worst crimes in a community, where all your possessions might be in an unsecured tent, punishments ranged from flogging to banishment to hanging. Murder was usually punished by hanging, though much depended on the circumstances and the people involved. The famous California vigilante justice stemmed from these miners' courts, which established a tradition of community-based punishment that persisted long after proper legal institutions were established. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest in most camps, though not everyone observed it. deeply religious miners would refuse to work on Sunday, attending impromptu church services if a preacher was available, or holding prayer meetings among themselves. Others saw Sunday as an opportunity for errands and chores, washing clothes, repairing equipment, hunting or fishing, making the trip to the nearest town for supplies. And some miners, especially those who didn't subscribe to Christian traditions, simply worked 7 days a week, reasoning that every day not mining was money left in the ground. The Sunday trip to town was a major event for many miners. After a week or more in the isolation of the camps, the prospect of seeing a settlement with stores, saloons, and people who weren't your immediate campmates was exciting. Miners would clean themselves up as best they could, which usually meant washing face and hands and putting on their least dirty shirt, and make the journey to whatever town or settlement was nearest. These towns, often little more than a collection of tents and ramshackle buildings, nonetheless represented civilization to miners who'd been living rough. The presence of women, even if they were primarily prostitutes or the wives of merchants, was notable in the overwhelmingly male world of the mining camps. The availability of cooked food that wasn't beans, even if it was barely better, felt like luxury. The chance to buy supplies, mail letters home, hear news from the outside world, all made the Sunday trip worthwhile, despite the time and energy it consumed. The saloons and gambling halls that sprang up in every mining town were designed to extract as much of the miners' earnings as possible, as efficiently as possible. The whiskey was often watered down or worse, adulterated with additives to stretch supplies and increase profits. The gambling was sometimes honest, sometimes rigged, with marked cards, and loaded dice common enough that smart miners learned to be suspicious. The entertainment, whether it was music, dancing, or theatrical performances, was usually crude and overpriced, but still drew crowds of men desperate for any distraction from their hard lives. Prostitution was open and ubiquitous, with women working in dedicated brothels, in rooms above saloons, or sometimes just in tents. The prices were extraordinary by Eastern standards, with prostitutes charging $5 to $10 for services that might cost 50 cents back east. This reflected both the scarcity of women in California and the inflated economy of the gold rush. Some prostitutes made substantial fortunes, accumulating more wealth in a few years than most miners would see in a lifetime of hard labor. The women working as prostitutes came from varied backgrounds and circumstances. Some had chosen the work as the most lucrative option available to them. Others had been coerced or had no alternatives after being abandoned or widowed in California with no way to support themselves or get home. A few managed to accumulate enough money to retire from the work and establish legitimate businesses. Many others were trapped in debt to the brothel owners or pimps who controlled them, unable to escape the work no matter how much they earned. The mail was a crucial lifeline to the outside world for miners. Letters from home could take months to arrive, traveling by ship around Cape Horn or across the Isthmus of Panama. When mail did arrive in camp, it was a major event, with men crowding around whoever had been designated to collect the mail from town. A letter from home could lift spirits for days, providing connection to the lives and people miners had left behind. Or it could devastate, bringing news of deaths, family troubles, or other problems that the miner was powerless to address from California. Writing letters home was equally important, but often difficult. What did you say? Did you admit that you weren't finding much gold, that the dream wasn't working out as planned? Or did you maintain the fiction that success was just around the corner, keeping hope alive for family members who were depending on you? Many miners struggled with this question. writing vague letters that neither fully admitted failure nor falsely claimed success, instead focusing on describing California and promising that things would improve soon. The isolation of camp life weighed heavily on many miners. Humans are social creatures, and while the camps provided some community, it was a limited and often dysfunctional one. You were surrounded by people, but often felt alone. The shared experience of mining provided some bond, but the competitive nature of the work and the diverse backgrounds of the miners made deep friendships difficult. Men would live side by side for months and barely know each other beyond surface details. Loneliness drove some miners to despair. Suicide was more common in the mining camps than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Men would simply disappear, later found in the woods having hanged themselves or shot themselves. Others would develop a kind of melancholy that miners called the blues, or seeing the elephant, a reference to the expression that those who'd seen the elephant had experienced something extraordinary but often disappointing. These men would become withdrawn and listless, unable to work effectively, sometimes wasting away from depression and neglect. Mental health problems were poorly understood and completely untreated in the mining camps. Men who might have benefited from support or treatment instead struggled alone or were simply considered weak or lazy by their companions. The masculine culture of the camps discouraged admitting to emotional or psychological struggles. You were supposed to be tough, to endure hardship without complaint. Admitting that you were struggling mentally was seen as shameful, so men suffered in silence until they either recovered on their own or succumbed entirely. The camp itself was a study in diversity and inequality that would have been remarkable in any other context, but was typical for the gold rush. You had men from every corner of America and increasingly from around the world. Chinese immigrants arrived in large numbers, often organized into companies sponsored by merchants back in China, who financed their passage in exchange for a cut of their earnings. Chilean and Mexican miners brought expertise from their own country's mining industries. Europeans came seeking opportunity. Even Australians made the journey, which was extraordinary given the distance. This should have been a cosmopolitan utopia, all these cultures mingling in pursuit of a common dream. Instead, it revealed the worst of human nature. The American miners, especially those from the South, brought their racial attitudes with them. They resented the Chinese for being willing to work harder for less. They despised the Mexicans and Chileans, despite the fact that California had been Mexican territory just a year earlier. They treated black miners like Samuel with suspicion and hostility, even though slavery was illegal in California. The racism wasn't just personal prejudice. It became systematized through miners' courts and camp rules that explicitly discriminated against non-whites. Many camps banned Chinese miners entirely. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 specifically targeted non-Americans, requiring them to pay exorbitant monthly fees for the privilege of mining. It was eventually repealed and then reinstated in a modified form targeting specifically Chinese and Mexican miners. The irony was bitter. A place advertised as a land of opportunity where any man could make his fortune turned out to be just as stratified and unjust as the society people had left behind. Samuel faced this discrimination daily. Despite being American-born and as entitled to mine as anyone else, he was constantly challenged, threatened, and excluded. Other miners tried to run him off his claim. Merchants in Sacramento charged him higher prices. When disputes arose, miners' courts invariably ruled against him. James witnessed one particularly ugly incident where Samuel found a substantial nugget, only to have 3 white miners claim it was actually from their claim and he must have stolen it. The resulting miners' court, if you could call it that, was a kangaroo proceeding that ended with Samuel being forced to hand over the nugget and threatened with hanging if he didn't leave the area immediately. James was ashamed to admit he didn't intervene more forcefully. He spoke up, said it wasn't right, but he didn't risk his own safety or standing in the community. This was the moral compromise that defined the gold rush and defines every bubble. When everyone around you is participating in injustice or delusion, it becomes easier to go along than to stand against the crowd. James told himself he was just being practical, that martyring himself wouldn't help Samuel anyway, but he knew these were rationalizations for cowardice. The physical labor of mining was only part of the challenge. The environment itself was harsh in ways James hadn't anticipated. The river water was frigid even in summer because it flowed down from mountain snowmelt. Standing in it for hours caused numbness and pain that persisted long after you got out. The sun beat down mercilessly, burning skin and causing heat exhaustion. Mosquitoes and other insects were relentless, raising welts that itched and sometimes became infected. The dust got into everything, coating your throat and lungs, causing chronic coughing. Then there was the food situation. Scurvy was epidemic in the mining camps because fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce and expensive. Miners survived on beans, salt pork, hardtack, and coffee. A diet almost designed to destroy health. Some men's teeth fell out. Others developed skin diseases. The lucky ones who could afford it occasionally bought potatoes or onions at astronomical prices. James watched men become skeletal versions of themselves, bodies consuming muscle mass because the calories from their meager rations weren't sufficient for the brutal physical labor they were performing. The camps themselves were exercises in squalor, with hundreds or thousands of men living in close proximity with no sanitation infrastructure. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery was so common it was just called the California Quickstep, a euphemism for the constant diarrhea that weakened and sometimes killed miners. Typhoid swept through camps regularly. Cholera outbreaks could kill dozens in a week. The attitude toward these diseases was fatalistic. Men would sicken, die, and be buried within days, their possessions immediately claimed by others who would repeat the cycle. James fell ill 3 weeks into mining. It started with stomach cramps that he tried to ignore, then progressed to debilitating diarrhea and fever. He lay in his shelter for 5 days, unable to work, using up supplies and savings with nothing coming in. The brothers from Vermont brought him water and made sure he didn't die, which was more than many sick miners received. In the camps, you were only as valuable as your ability to work. Once you couldn't contribute, you became a burden that most people were happy to ignore. He recovered, though he'd lost considerable weight and strength. The experience frightened him more than anything on the trail west. Out there, the dangers were obvious and dramatic. Here, death came from invisible causes, bacteria and parasites that you couldn't fight with guns or determination. You could do everything right and still get sick. You could work hard, find gold, and then lose it all to medical expenses, or simply die before you could spend it. The randomness was terrifying. But miners developed a kind of gallows humor about the whole situation. They gave their claims whimsical names: Dead Broke Gulch, Poverty Hill, Hangtown Creek, Murderer's Bar. These names were jokes, but also truth-telling. They reflected the reality that most men would leave California poorer than they arrived, if they left at all. The mythology of the gold rush focused on the few spectacular successes while ignoring the many failures. This is exactly what happens in every bubble. You hear about the guy who became a millionaire from Bitcoin while ignoring the thousands who lost their life savings. You hear about the startup that went public and made its founders rich while ignoring the 95% that failed. By October, James had to admit he wasn't making it as a miner. He'd found enough gold to barely cover his expenses, but he was falling behind, eating into the last of his reserves. Winter was coming, which would make mining even more difficult. He needed to pivot, to find another way to make money in California, or he'd end up dead or destitute. This moment of realization came to most miners eventually. Some made the pivot successfully. Others didn't and paid the price. He remembered Thomas Wu's strategy. Serve the miners rather than mine yourself. The problem was that by late 1849, even those niches were getting crowded. Still, James had skills from his farming background that might be valuable. He could build things, repair equipment, grow food. The mining economy needed all these services. So he made his way back to Sacramento to look for opportunities in the burgeoning service sector. Sacramento had grown even more chaotic in the few months since James first arrived. The population had swelled to maybe 20,000, with more arriving every day. The city was a maze of tents, wooden buildings thrown up with minimal concern for safety or permanence, and muddy streets that became impassable when it rained. Fires were common because of all the canvas and hastily constructed wooden structures packed close, together with open flames for cooking and heating. James witnessed one such fire burn through an entire block, destroying dozens of businesses and homes in less than an hour. The growth of Sacramento and San Francisco from tiny settlements to major urban centers in the span of months represented one of the most remarkable instances of rapid urbanization in history. Sacramento, which had been virtually nothing before James Sutter began developing his settlement, exploded to 10,000 people by early 1849 and 20,000 by the end of that year. The growth was so rapid that infrastructure couldn't possibly keep pace, creating an urban environment that was exciting, chaotic, and often nightmarish in equal measure. The streets, if you could call them that, were unpaved dirt tracks that turned into rivers of mud during rain. The mud could be knee-deep in places, swallowing boots and making movement nearly impossible. Horses and mules would sink into the muck, sometimes having to be abandoned there until the ground dried enough to extract them. Wagons got stuck constantly, blocking traffic and creating bottlenecks that could paralyze entire sections of the city for hours or days. The solution to the mud problem, at least the temporary solution, was both ingenious and wasteful. Merchants and residents would throw anything solid into the streets to create pathways. Wooden planks, barrels, bags of flour or rice that had gotten wet and were considered ruined, even stoves and furniture. There are documented cases of pianos being thrown into Sacramento streets to create stepping stones across the mud. The streets became a kind of archaeological layering of California's material excess, with months or years of discarded goods gradually creating a semi-solid surface. Buildings in the early boom period were temporary structures thrown up with no expectation of permanence. Canvas tents served as stores, saloons, hotels, and homes. Wooden buildings, when they appeared, were constructed as quickly and cheaply as possible, using lumber that was often green and unseasoned. These structures would warp, crack, and sometimes collapse as the wood dried and contracted. Fires could race through these buildings in minutes, and did so regularly. The fire of November 1850 in Sacramento was particularly devastating, destroying 300 buildings and causing millions of dollars in damage. James had been in the city that day, having come down from his way stations to purchase supplies. He watched as the fire started in a bakery and spread with terrifying speed. carried by strong winds and fed by the dry, flimsy buildings. Men formed bucket brigades passing water from the river, but it was hopeless. The fire moved faster than they could respond. The response to the fire was characteristically California. Within hours, before the ashes had even cooled, merchants were already planning to rebuild. By the next day, temporary structures were going up on the ruins of destroyed buildings. Within weeks, the burned district was largely rebuilt, though with slightly better materials and planning than before. This cycle of destruction and reconstruction happened repeatedly in California cities during the gold rush era. San Francisco suffered 6 major fires between December 1849 and June 1851, each destroying large portions of the city, each followed by rapid rebuilding. The commercial activity in Sacramento and San Francisco was intense and diverse beyond anything in American cities of comparable size. You could find virtually any good or service if you were willing to pay the inflated prices. Stores sold everything from mining equipment to clothing to books to furniture imported from around the world. Restaurants served food from multiple cuisines as immigrants brought their culinary traditions. Saloons and gambling halls operated 24 hours a day, never closing because there was always someone with money to spend. The merchants who operated these businesses were often more successful than the miners they served. A man named Sam Brannan famously bought up all the mining equipment and supplies in San Francisco before news of the gold discovery spread widely, then sold them at enormous markups to the first wave of gold seekers. He reportedly made $36,000 in just 2 months, becoming California's first millionaire through retail rather than mining. His story was typical of merchant success in the gold rush. The pricing in California cities was astronomical by Eastern standards. A barrel of flour that cost $5 in New York would sell for $50 in Sacramento. Boots that cost $3 back east went for $25 or $30 in California. Fresh eggs could cost $1 each. These prices reflected both the genuine scarcity of goods that had to be shipped thousands of miles and the willingness of miners flush with gold dust to pay whatever was asked. The result was an economy where fortunes could be made in trade, while miners themselves struggled. Banking emerged quickly as an essential service in this cash-flush but trust-poor environment. The first banks were often operated by merchants who had safes and would store gold dust for miners for a fee. These evolved into more formal banking institutions that would exchange dust for coins, provide credit, and arrange transfers of money back east. The banking business was lucrative but also risky, with bank failures common when merchants absconded with deposits or simply made bad decisions. The most successful banks were those backed by established Eastern capital. Wells Fargo, founded by Henry Wells and William Fargo in 1852, quickly dominated California banking and express services. They provided secure storage for gold, arranged shipments back east, exchanged currency, and offered banking services with the backing of their Eastern financial connections. The iconic green and gold Wells Fargo wagons became a familiar sight throughout California, symbols of financial stability in a chaotic environment. The hotel and boarding house business was another area of merchant success. With thousands of people arriving constantly and needing places to stay, any structure that could house people could generate revenue. The quality of these establishments varied enormously. At the low end were boarding houses that offered a spot on a floor in a crowded room for $1 a night. At the high end were hotels like the St. Francis in San Francisco that aspired to Eastern standards of luxury and charged accordingly. Most accommodations fell somewhere in between, rough but functional spaces that offered a bed, usually shared with another person, and basic meals. The bed sharing was not about intimacy, but about maximizing the use of limited resources. You'd rent a bed for a shift, perhaps 8 hours, and when your time was up, someone else would take your place in the still warm sheets. This was called hotbedding and was completely normal in California during the boom years. The entertainment industry flourished in California cities, feeding the demand of miners and other workers for distraction from their hard lives. Theatres sprang up, initially just canvas tents with rough stages, but eventually becoming more elaborate structures. The performances ranged from Shakespeare to variety shows to musical performances. The quality was often questionable, but audiences were enthusiastic and undiscriminating. Actors and entertainers could make good money in California, far more than they could in the competitive entertainment markets of the East. Gambling halls were the most ubiquitous form of entertainment, operating around the clock in every city and large town. These ranged from simple setups with a few tables in the back of a saloon to elaborate establishments with dozens of gaming tables, bars, and sometimes even restaurants. The games included poker, faro, roulette, chuck-a-luck, and various dice games. The house usually had an edge, but that didn't stop miners from betting their earnings, convinced that luck would favour them. The gambling establishments were also social centres, places where news was exchanged, deals were made, and information flowed. A smart businessman would spend time in the gambling halls not necessarily to gamble, but to network and gather intelligence. You could learn about new strikes, about ships arriving with goods to sell, about claims for sale, about opportunities and threats. The gambling halls were information exchanges as much as places to lose money. Prostitution was so ubiquitous in California cities that it barely needed to hide. Red light districts existed openly, with brothels operating semi-legally and street prostitution common in certain areas. The women working in this trade came from varied backgrounds. Americans from the East who'd come west seeking opportunity, immigrants from Europe and Latin America, Chinese women often controlled by tongs and syndicates. The treatment and circumstances of these women varied enormously, from relatively independent operators who made good money to virtual slaves, controlled by pimps or criminal organizations. The city governments, such as they were understaffed, underfinanced, and generally ineffective at addressing the myriad problems of boom urbanization. Sacramento and San Francisco incorporated in 1850, creating formal city governments, but these were weak institutions struggling to impose order on chaos. The tax base was uncertain, with property lines unclear and many residents considering themselves temporary and thus not subject to local taxation. Enforcing laws was difficult when the police force might consist of a half-dozen men trying to control tens of thousands of residents. The result was that much governance happened through private means. Merchant associations would organize to address common problems like fire protection or maintaining certain streets. Vigilante committees would form to address crime when official law enforcement seemed inadequate. These extra-legal organizations were effective in some ways, but also problematic, as they operated without oversight and could be hijacked by personal vendettas or prejudices. The vigilance committees in San Francisco became particularly notorious. The Committee of Vigilance formed in 1851 in response to what was perceived as rampant crime and government ineffectiveness. The committee, composed mainly of merchants and property owners, essentially took over law enforcement, arresting suspected criminals, conducting trials, and carrying out executions. They hanged 4 men and drove dozens more out of the city. The legality of these actions was questionable, but they enjoyed wide popular support from the business community, who saw them as necessary to protect property and commerce. The ethnic and racial diversity of California cities was remarkable for the time. San Francisco in 1850 contained Americans from every state, Mexicans and Chileans from Latin America, French and German immigrants, Australians, Chinese, Hawaiians, and various other groups. This diversity could have created a cosmopolitan atmosphere, but instead, it often led to tension and conflict as different groups competed for resources and opportunity. The Chinese population in San Francisco grew rapidly from just a handful in 1848 to thousands by the early 1850s. Chinatown emerged as a distinct neighborhood where Chinese residents could find familiar food, language, and community. But this concentration also made the Chinese population a target for resentment and violence. Anti-Chinese sentiment, already present in the mining camps, was equally strong in cities, manifesting in discriminatory laws, economic restrictions, and occasional mob violence. The newspaper industry flourished in California, with publications springing up to serve the information-hungry population. The Alta California, Sacramento Union, and various other papers provided news from the mines, shipping information, commercial intelligence, and entertainment. The papers also played a significant role in shaping perceptions of California and the gold rush, generally promoting optimistic narratives that served the interests of the business community, even when reality was more complicated. The newspapers were sometimes honest about the challenges and failures of the gold rush, particularly when reporting on specific incidents or court cases. But the overall editorial stance of most papers was boosterish, emphasizing California's potential and opportunities while downplaying the hardships and disappointments. This wasn't necessarily dishonest, so much as reflecting the genuine belief of California's establishment that the state's future was bright despite current difficulties. Churches and religious institutions struggled to establish themselves in early California cities. The transient male-dominated population wasn't particularly interested in organized religion, and ministers who came to California often found themselves preaching to small congregations in rough settings. But gradually, churches were built and congregations formed, providing some moral and social structure in communities that often seem to lack both. The religious institutions served important social functions beyond worship. They provided spaces for community gathering, organized charity for the poor and sick, established schools for the growing number of families, and generally worked to civilize California society. The Catholic Church was particularly active, serving the Mexican and Latino populations, as well as Irish and other Catholic immigrants. Protestant denominations competed for the American population, with Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and others all establishing presences. Education was haphazard in early California cities. There were few public schools, and those that existed were poorly funded and staffed. Wealthy families hired private tutors or sent their children back east for education. Most children, if they were in California at all, received little to no formal schooling. This was both a practical problem and a social concern, as California leaders recognized that building a stable society would require an educated population. The legal profession thrived in California, though not always in ways that served justice. Lawyers were needed for everything from claim disputes to contract negotiations to defending or prosecuting criminals. The legal system was chaotic, with overlapping jurisdictions, unclear laws, and conflicting precedents from Mexican, military, and emerging California legal frameworks. Smart lawyers could navigate this chaos to their advantage and their clients' benefit, and many made fortunes doing so. Medical care in California cities was better than in the mining camps, but still rudimentary by modern standards. Doctors could treat injuries and some diseases, but many medical practices were still based on incomplete or incorrect understanding of illness. Bleeding, purging, and mercury-based treatments were common despite being harmful. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic techniques, making it a last resort that many patients didn't survive. The frequent epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and other diseases overwhelmed whatever medical infrastructure existed. The hospitals that did exist were primarily charitable institutions run by religious organizations or funded by miners' fees. The conditions in these hospitals were often grim, with minimal sanitation and overcrowded wards where disease spread easily. Doctors and nurses, the latter usually nuns or other religious women, did what they could with limited resources and knowledge. Simply surviving a stay in a hospital was something of an achievement. Despite all these challenges and problems, California cities were also places of opportunity and possibility in ways that were unprecedented in American society. Social mobility was real. A person could arrive with nothing and, through luck or hard work or cunning, establish themselves as a merchant or professional within months or years. The old hierarchies of Eastern society mattered less in California, where everyone was new and wealth was being created and lost constantly. This fluidity was both exhilarating and unsettling, offering opportunity but also risk and uncertainty. The level of commerce was staggering. Every type of business you could imagine had sprung up to serve the miners. Saloons and gambling halls were the most numerous and profitable. Men who'd been working crushing labor in the streams all week would come to town and blow their earnings on liquor and cards in a single night. Prostitution was ubiquitous, with women charging rates that would have been unthinkable anywhere else. Merchants sold tools, clothes, food, medicine, all at prices marked up to absurd levels. A pair of boots that cost $5 in New York sold for $50 in Sacramento. Then there were the auxiliary services, laundries, overwhelmingly run by Chinese immigrants, charged enormous rates to wash clothes because miners had no time or facilities to do it themselves. Boarding houses offered beds in dormitory-style rooms where men slept in shifts. Restaurants served meals, though calling them restaurants was generous. Most were just tents with plank tables where you ate whatever was available for $1 or more. The food was universally terrible, but when you've been eating hardtack and beans for weeks, even bad restaurant food seemed like luxury. James found work with a man named Henry Cooper, who ran a freight and supply business. Cooper had arrived in '48 and had the good sense to immediately pivot from mining to logistics. He'd made a small fortune transporting goods from San Francisco up to the mining camps, charging rates that made robber barons look generous, but which miners paid because they had no choice. He needed men who could handle wagons, load and unload cargo, and occasionally fight off bandits who were becoming increasingly bold on the remote trails. The pay was better than mining had been, and more reliable. $3 a day plus meals, which might not sound impressive but was actually decent given that James was no longer incurring the daily expenses of mining supplies. The work was hard, lots of heavy lifting and long days on rough roads, but it wasn't the soul-crushing monotony of panning for gold. And James got to see more of California, traveling to different camps and settlements, witnessing the full scope of the gold rush. The diversity of mining operations was remarkable. You had everything from lone prospectors with pans to sophisticated industrial operations employing dozens of men. Some miners had formed companies, pooling resources to dig more extensive claims or build elaborate water distribution systems. Others were experimenting with new technologies, like hydraulic mining, which used high-pressure water jets to blast away hillsides and expose gold-bearing gravel. This was devastatingly effective at extracting gold, but also catastrophically destructive to the environment. James delivered supplies to one hydraulic mining operation and was stunned by the scale of destruction. An entire hillside had been washed away, leaving a barren moonscape of exposed earth and rock. The water used in the operation, thick with sediment and laced with mercury used to separate gold from ore, was dumped back into the river where it flowed downstream to other mining camps and eventually to farmland in the Central Valley. Nobody seemed concerned about the long-term consequences. The attitude was to extract as much wealth as quickly as possible and worry about cleanup never. This environmental destruction was one of the gold rush's most enduring but least discussed legacies. The mercury contamination alone would persist for over a century, poisoning water systems and accumulating in fish that people ate. The hydraulic mining destroyed thousands of acres of pristine wilderness, caused flooding by filling riverbeds with sediment, and fundamentally altered California's hydrology. It was environmental devastation on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until industrial strip mining in the 20th century. But in 1849 and 50, nobody cared. The mentality was purely extractive. California was seen as an infinite resource to be exploited, not a place to build a sustainable life. This is another hallmark of bubble mentality. Short-term thinking dominates. You're not planning for what happens in 5 or 10 years. You're trying to get rich right now, this instant, before the opportunity disappears. And you externalize all the costs, dump them on someone else, future generations, the environment, whatever. Just get yours and get out. Working for Cooper gave James insight into the economics of the gold rush that miners themselves rarely understood. The real money was in the margins, the spaces between the mining itself. Cooper was making more money moving goods than most miners made extracting gold. The merchants were getting rich selling supplies. The saloon owners were raking in cash. The few women who ran boarding houses or laundries were accumulating small fortunes. The people actually digging in the dirt and standing in cold water all day. They were mostly breaking even or going broke. This was the great unspoken truth of the gold rush, and it's the truth of every speculative bubble. The people providing services to the speculators make more money than the speculators themselves. During the dot-com boom, it wasn't the startup founders who were guaranteed to profit. It was the lawyers drawing up incorporation papers, the real estate agents renting office space, the consultants advising on business strategy, the headhunters finding employees. The same dynamic played out in the housing bubble, the cryptocurrency craze, and every other speculative mania in history. James was learning this lesson firsthand. His decision to stop mining and start working for Cooper was probably what saved him from complete ruin. He was still in California, still participating in the gold rush, but he'd shifted from being a speculator to being a service provider. It was a crucial distinction that meant the difference between prosperity and poverty for thousands of people. Through his work, James encountered the full spectrum of humanity that the gold rush attracted. There were earnest farmers like he'd been, trying to save failing operations back home. There were adventurers and gamblers who thrived on the chaos and uncertainty. There were criminals and con artists running scams ranging from simple theft to elaborate schemes involving fake mining companies. There were families who'd come west hoping to start new lives in a new land. And increasingly, there were corporate representatives sent by mining companies in the East and in Europe to buy up claims and consolidate operations. This last group represented the beginning of the end for the individual miner. By late 1849, it was becoming clear that the age of the lone prospector was giving way to industrial mining. The easy gold was gone. What remained required capital, equipment, and expertise that individual miners couldn't muster. So companies formed, often in San Francisco, that would buy up clusters of claims, import machinery, hire miners as wage laborers, and extract gold through economies of scale that no individual could match. James watched this transition with mixed feelings. On one hand, it meant more stable employment opportunities for men like him. The mining companies needed workers, and they paid regular wages. On the other hand, it crushed the dream that had brought everyone to California in the first place. The idea that an ordinary man could strike it rich through his own effort and luck. That dream was being replaced by the reality of wage labor and corporate control, which was exactly what many miners had been trying to escape back east. He reconnected with Thomas Wu in early 1850. Thomas had done well for himself, working claims that other miners had abandoned as unprofitable and carefully extracting what gold remained. He'd saved nearly $1,000, an impressive sum, and was preparing to open a general store as he'd planned. But he was also deeply worried about the rising anti-Chinese sentiment in the camps and cities. The Chinese population in California had exploded from a few hundred to several thousand, with more arriving on every ship from Canton. They were hard workers who were willing to take claims that others had given up on and extract value through sheer persistence. This should have been admirable, but instead it provoked resentment from American miners who saw them as unfair competition. The fact that Chinese miners often lived more cheaply, sending most of their earnings back to families in China rather than spending it in local saloons and stores, further aggravated the hostility. Thomas told James about Chinese miners being driven from claims at gunpoint, about beatings and murders that went unpunished because the miners' courts and the few actual law enforcement officials didn't consider crimes against Chinese worth investigating. Some camps had passed rules explicitly banning Chinese from mining in their districts. The foreign miners' tax, when it was reimposed, was enforced almost exclusively against Chinese and Mexican miners, while European immigrants faced little scrutiny. This racism was both economic and cultural. The American miners rationalized their prejudice by claiming the Chinese were somehow alien, impossible to assimilate, a threat to white civilization. The language used against them was ugly and dehumanizing. But underneath the cultural justifications was simple economic resentment. The Chinese were succeeding where many Americans were failing, and rather than examine their own shortcomings, the Americans blamed the competition. James tried to be supportive, but he also recognized his own limitations. He wasn't going to single-handedly fight the racism pervading California. He couldn't protect Thomas from the violence that was becoming increasingly common. All he could do was maintain their friendship and help where he could, which felt inadequate, but was more than most American miners offered. The winter of 1849 into 50 was brutal. Heavy rains turned the mining camps into seas of mud. Rivers flooded, washing away claims and equipment. In the mountains, snow buried operations and trapped miners who'd been too stubborn or too broke to leave before the passes closed. Disease spread rapidly in the cold, damp conditions. James, working out of Sacramento, watched men arrive from the camps, looking like walking corpses, skeletal and sick, having abandoned their claims to seek medical care or simply to escape the misery. Sacramento itself flooded repeatedly that winter. The city's location at the confluence of rivers made it vulnerable, and nobody had bothered to build adequate levees or drainage systems. When the rivers rose, entire neighborhoods went underwater. Buildings collapsed. Inventory was destroyed. People drowned trying to evacuate. And then, when the waters receded, everyone just rebuilt on the same spot and hoped next year would be better. The optimism was admirable or insane, depending on your perspective. But the flood also demonstrated something important about California's emerging culture, its resilience and adaptability. After each disaster, whether fire or flood or epidemic, the city rebuilt faster and sometimes better. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity in catastrophe. After fires, they sold lumber and construction services. After floods, they offered boats for transport and high ground for storage. The California spirit was emerging, optimistic, opportunistic, and utterly ruthless. By spring of 1850, James had saved enough money to consider his options. He could continue working for Cooper, which provided steady income but no real chance of significant wealth. He could try mining again, though he had no illusions about his chances of striking it rich. Or he could follow Thomas's lead and start some kind of business serving the mining economy. The question was, what kind of business and where? The answer came unexpectedly. Cooper sent James to deliver supplies to a new camp that had sprung up in the foothills east of Sacramento. The camp, called Hangtown, because its miners' court, had enthusiastically hanged several alleged criminals in quick succession, was growing rapidly as miners worked their way up tributaries, searching for undiscovered deposits. The trip took 3 days each way, travelling through increasingly rough terrain. What struck James about Hangtown and similar camps was how temporary everything felt. Buildings were thrown up with no expectation they'd stand for more than a season. Nobody planted gardens or trees or did anything suggesting permanence. The entire infrastructure was designed for extraction and exploitation, not habitation. And yet people were living there, thousands of them, creating a kind of society, even if it was dysfunctional and transient. On his return trip, James stopped at a settlement that was barely more than a few tents and a makeshift store. The proprietor, a woman named Margaret Sullivan, was selling basic supplies to miners heading up into the mountains. What caught James's attention was that she was also selling vegetables from a small garden and eggs from chickens she kept. The miners were paying exorbitant prices for fresh food, desperate for something besides beans and salt pork. This gave James an idea. What if instead of just transporting goods, he established way stations along the major trails, places where miners traveling to and from camps could buy supplies, get a meal, maybe sleep in a real bed. And at these way stations, he could grow some food, keep animals, provide the fresh provisions that miners craved and would pay premium prices for. It wouldn't make him rich overnight, but it could be a sustainable business that served a real need. He discussed the idea with Cooper, who was intrigued enough to offer a partnership. Cooper would provide the initial capital and handle the supply side, getting goods up from San Francisco. James would establish and run the way stations. They'd split the profits. It was a solid arrangement that gave James a path forward that didn't involve either the brutal labour of mining or the indefinite tedium of freight work. Over the next few months, James established three-way stations along major routes into the gold country. Each was a modest operation: a small building for the store and sleeping quarters, a stable for animals, a garden plot, and a few outbuildings. He hired help when needed, though finding reliable workers was challenging because everyone still had gold fever and would abandon regular work the moment they heard about a new strike. The way stations were immediately profitable. Miners, travelling to and from the diggings, desperately needed the services James provided. He charged high prices because that's what the market would bear, but he also provided genuine value. The meals were simple, but made with fresh ingredients. The sleeping quarters were basic, but clean. The supplies were marked up, but actually available, which wasn't always the case in the camps themselves. Running these way stations gave James a unique perspective on the gold rush's progression. He could see trends developing based on the traffic and conversations. When a new strike was reported, he'd see a flood of miners heading toward it. A few weeks later, disappointed men would trudge back, having found the rumors exaggerated or all the good claims already taken. He could track the seasons by the flow: busy in summer when mining was easier, quiet in winter when operations shut down or men retreated to the cities. He also witnessed the increasing sophistication of mining operations. Individual miners with pans were giving way to small companies with sluices and cradles. These were in turn being replaced by larger operations with more equipment and capital. The tools of mining were evolving rapidly as people experimented and innovated. Long toms, which were extended sluices that could process more gravel, became common. Arrastra mills, borrowed from Mexican mining traditions, were used to crush rock. And hydraulic monitors, those devastating water cannons, began appearing more frequently. One of James's way stations became a regular stop for a mining company called the Auburn Consolidated, which was one of the larger operations in the region. The company's superintendent, a Yale graduate named Charles Henderson, would stay at the way station when traveling between the mine and Sacramento. Henderson was sophisticated and educated, utterly unlike the rough miners who comprised most of James's customers. Their conversations revealed the business side of the gold rush that existed parallel to, but separate from the mythology of individual prospectors. Henderson explained how Auburn Consolidated worked. The company had been formed in San Francisco by a group of investors who pooled capital to buy up numerous small claims along a promising stretch of creek. They'd imported machinery from the east, including a steam engine to power pumps and other equipment. They employed 40 men at fixed wages, paying them whether they found gold that day or not. The operation was essentially industrial mining, treating gold extraction as a business to be optimized rather than a gamble to be won. The company's investors weren't miners. They were merchants, lawyers, ship captains, people who'd made money through other means and were now investing in gold mining the way they might invest in any other business. They expected regular reports on operations, accounting of expenditures and returns, professional management. This was a far cry from the lone prospector with his pan and his dream. Henderson himself had never planned to go into mining. He'd come to California in '49, thinking he'd practice law in San Francisco. But he quickly realized there was more money in managing mining operations than in legal work, so he taught himself geology and engineering, learned from Mexican and Chilean miners who had experience, and positioned himself as an expert. Now he made a good salary managing the Auburn Consolidated and had options to buy company stock. He'd never touched a gold pan in his life. This was the future of California mining, and Henderson knew it. The era of individual prospectors was ending. Gold extraction would increasingly be the domain of companies with capital and expertise. The individual miner would become a wage laborer, working for someone else's profit. It was the same transition that had happened in every industry during the Industrial Revolution, and now it was coming to gold mining. Some miners accepted this transition. They were tired of the uncertainty and hardship of independent prospecting. Steady wages, even if they were lower than what you might make with a good claim, had appeal. You knew where your next meal was coming from. You weren't gambling your life savings every day. For men with families or ambitions beyond mere survival, wage labour had advantages. But other miners resented it bitterly. They'd come to California to be independent, to work for themselves, to have a chance at striking it rich through their own efforts. Becoming wage labourers for mining companies felt like betrayal of the whole gold rush dream. These men would continue prospecting independently, even as it became increasingly unprofitable, clinging to the hope of one big strike that would change everything. James understood both perspectives because he'd experienced both sides. He'd tried independent mining and found it brutal and unrewarding. He'd become a wage worker for Cooper and found it stable but limiting. Now he was a small businessman, which combined elements of both. He controlled his own destiny, but also bore the risks and responsibilities of ownership. Each path had its trade-offs, and the right choice depended on your personality, resources, and tolerance for risk. By late 1850, the first wave of gold rush fever was subsiding. The news had spread back east that California wasn't the automatic road to riches that had been advertised. Letters from disappointed miners reached families back home, describing the reality of brutal labour, high costs, and frequent failure. Newspapers began running more balanced stories about the gold rush, acknowledging that most miners weren't getting rich. The flood of emigrants heading west began to slow, though it was still substantial compared to pre-gold rush levels. But even as the individual prospector era waned, California itself was transforming in fascinating ways. The population had exploded from about 15,000 in 1848 to nearly 100,000 by late 1850. San Francisco had become a real city, not just a boomtown, but an urban center with banks, newspapers, theaters, churches, and all the trappings of civilization. Sacramento was following a similar trajectory. Smaller settlements were either growing into towns or disappearing as the mining in their areas played out. California was also becoming politically organized. It had applied for statehood, skipping the territorial phase entirely because of its booming population and economic importance. The debates around statehood were contentious, particularly regarding slavery. California wanted to enter as a free state, which upset the balance between free and slave states and contributed to the national tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. But on September 9, 1850, California was admitted as the 31st state, a remarkable achievement for a place that barely existed as American territory 2 years earlier. This political organization brought both benefits and challenges. On one hand, it meant more formal legal structures, courts that had actual authority rather than the ad hoc miners' courts, and law enforcement that could potentially bring order to the chaos. On the other hand, it meant taxes and regulations and all the machinery of government that many California residents had come west specifically to escape. The tension between desire for order and resentment of authority would define California politics for decades. James's way stations continued to prosper through these changes. He'd found a successful niche and was building something sustainable. He'd even started thinking about permanence, about maybe buying land and building a proper home, rather than living in the rough quarters attached to his businesses. This was a psychological shift that many Californians were making. from seeing the state as a temporary workplace to extract wealth from, to seeing it as a home to build a life in. He'd also gotten involved with a woman named Elizabeth, a widow who ran a boarding house in Sacramento. She'd come to California with her husband in '49. He died of cholera within 3 months of arrival. Left alone in a strange place, with no means of support and no way to get home, she'd done what many women in similar circumstances did. She'd found a way to make money serving the overwhelmingly male population. Her boarding house was respectable, not a brothel, but it provided lodging and meals to miners, teamsters, merchants, and other transients passing through the city. Elizabeth was practical and unsentimental, qualities that James appreciated after his romantic notions had been beaten out of him by experience. She had no illusions about California or the gold rush. She'd seen too much death and disappointment to maintain any fantasies. But she was also resilient and capable, running a successful business in an environment where women were vastly outnumbered and often exploited. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of California's realities rather than passion or romance. The question of women in the gold rush was itself revealing. In the early days, California was overwhelmingly male, with ratios as high as 9 men for every woman. This gender imbalance had significant social consequences. It meant that women who were in California, regardless of their circumstances or character, were in high demand. Marriages happened quickly, often between people who barely knew each other. Women could command extraordinary salaries for work that would have paid pennies back east. But this also meant exploitation and danger. Prostitution was ubiquitous, and while some women chose that work as the most lucrative option available, many others were coerced or had no alternatives. The line between legitimate businesses like boarding houses or saloons and outright brothels was often blurry, and women faced harassment and violence that was rarely punished. The miners' courts and early California law enforcement were largely indifferent to crimes against women, especially if the women were considered disreputable. Elizabeth had navigated this environment successfully by being smart and tough. She set clear boundaries, maintained respectability despite running a business that catered to rough men, and accumulated capital that gave her independence. She told James stories about women she knew who'd made fortunes in California, not through mining, but through businesses, laundries, restaurants, boarding houses, and yes, prostitution. Some of these women became quite wealthy, far wealthier than most male miners. This was another aspect of the gold rush's economic reality that contradicted the mythology. While thousands of men were breaking their backs for minimal returns, some women were accumulating capital by providing services those men needed. The gender dynamics were complex and often exploitative, but they also created opportunities for women that didn't exist back east. It was a strange kind of liberation, born from desperation and inequality, but nonetheless real. As 1850 progressed into 51, the gold rush entered a new phase that historians would later call consolidation. The free-for-all of individual prospectors was giving way to organized mining companies. The easy surface gold was gone, replaced by the harder work of deep mining and hydraulic operations. The population was stabilizing, no longer the frenzied influx of emigrants, but a more sustainable level of arrivals balancing departures. California was becoming less of a temporary mining camp and more of a permanent society. James's way stations had to adapt to these changes. The traffic of prospectors heading to and from diggings was declining, but the traffic of freighters moving goods, of company employees traveling between operations and cities, of settlers arriving to farm the valleys and establish towns was increasing. James shifted his focus accordingly, providing services to this new clientele, while maintaining provisions for the miners who were still out there working claims. He also expanded into a new venture, farming. The agricultural potential of California's valleys was becoming evident. The climate was ideal for growing fruits and vegetables. Water, while increasingly contested, was available, and there was a huge market. All those miners and city dwellers needed to eat, and most food was still being imported from back east at enormous cost. James leased land near one of his way stations and started growing produce on a scale larger than just a kitchen garden. This agricultural development was itself another form of gold rush economics. The real gold in California would ultimately prove to be not the metal in the streams, but the soil in the valleys. Farming in California would eventually generate far more wealth than mining ever did. But in the early 1850s, this wasn't yet obvious. Agriculture was still seen as supplementary to mining, a way to feed the miners rather than an industry in itself. James's farming operation brought him into contact with a new set of challenges and conflicts. Water rights were becoming increasingly contentious as miners upstream diverted rivers and streams for their operations, leaving farmers downstream without adequate supply. Land ownership was murky, with overlapping claims based on old Mexican grants, squatters' rights, and new American surveys. And there was the ongoing displacement of Native Americans who had traditionally occupied and used the lands that Americans were now claiming. The treatment of California's native populations during the gold rush was genocidal, though that word wasn't used at the time. Tribes that had lived in California for thousands of years were suddenly faced with an invasion of foreigners who had no respect for their land rights or their lives. Miners would shoot Indians on sight in some areas, claiming they were dangerous or simply because they were in the way. Native villages were destroyed to make way for mining operations. Starvation became common as traditional food sources were disrupted. The California government offered minimal protection to native peoples, and in some cases actively encouraged their elimination. Massacres occurred regularly, and while occasionally these were prosecuted as crimes, more often they were ignored or even celebrated. The native population of California, which had been perhaps 300,000 before American arrival, would be reduced to less than 30,000 by the end of the 19th century. This Holocaust happened alongside and intertwined with the gold rush, though it's largely absent from the popular mythology. James witnessed some of this violence and displacement firsthand. Near one of his way stations, a village of Miwok people had lived for generations. Within 2 years of the gold rush reaching that area, the village was gone. Some of the inhabitants had died from introduced diseases. Others had been killed in conflicts with miners. The survivors had fled further into the mountains, or had been forced onto reservations. The land where they'd lived was taken over by miners and farmers, including James himself, who felt uncomfortable with the situation, but participated in it nonetheless. This was perhaps the darkest aspect of the gold rush, and one that reveals the most about the bubble mentality. When people are convinced they're part of some great opportunity or movement, they'll rationalize enormous cruelty and injustice. The miners and settlers weren't uniquely evil people. They were ordinary individuals who'd been caught up in a collective fever dream and who'd learned to not think too carefully about the consequences of their actions. The native peoples were obstacles to be removed, not human beings with rights and lives. This dehumanization allowed atrocities to happen that would have been unthinkable in other contexts. By 1852, James had built a successful and diversified business empire, if you could call his collection of way stations and a modest farm an empire. He was making good money, more than he could have imagined back on his failing farm in Ohio. He and Elizabeth had married in a simple ceremony in Sacramento, and she'd moved her boarding house operation to be closer to his way stations, creating a kind of hospitality network serving travelers in the gold country. Thomas Wu had also succeeded, opening his general store and making it profitable despite the continuing discrimination against Chinese merchants. He'd brought over relatives from China and was building a small commercial operation that served the Chinese mining community. The two men remained friends, meeting occasionally to share drinks and compare notes on the strange place California was becoming. But even success in California came with qualifications. James and Elizabeth were doing well relative to most gold rush participants, but they weren't rich. They weren't part of the new California elite that was forming in San Francisco and Sacramento, the merchant princes and mining magnates and real estate speculators who'd made millions from the gold rush. They were comfortable, secure, but still working hard every day to maintain their position. And they were aware that the boom couldn't last forever. Gold production in California had peaked in 1852 and was beginning its long decline. The state had produced $77 million worth of gold that year, an astonishing figure, but it was already clear that future years would yield less. The easily accessible deposits were exhausted. What remained required more capital and labor to extract, driving down profitability. The gold rush, while not over, was entering its terminal phase. The signs of the approaching bust were visible to anyone paying attention. Mining camps were being abandoned as deposits played out. Men who'd spent years in California were finally admitting defeat and heading home, or heading elsewhere to try their luck in new rushes in Oregon or later in Nevada. The shops and saloons and other businesses that had thrived serving miners were struggling as their customer base declined. Real estate prices in San Francisco, which had reached absurd heights during the boom, were starting to fall. But there was also denial, lots of it. People who'd invested their fortunes and identities into California's success didn't want to admit the party was ending. Newspapers continued publishing optimistic articles about new discoveries and technologies that would revitalize mining. Businessmen proposed elaborate schemes for bringing more people and capital to California. Politicians promised that California's growth would continue indefinitely. This is standard bubble behavior. Even as the fundamentals deteriorate, true believers insist everything is fine and double down on their bets. James and Elizabeth, having learned to be skeptical, prepared for harder times. They saved money rather than spending on luxuries. They diversified their businesses and reduced debt. They positioned themselves to weather the bust they saw coming. This was smart, but also frustrating, because it meant forgoing opportunities that others were still pursuing enthusiastically. When everyone around you is optimistic and spending freely, being cautious makes you look like a fool or a coward. The bust, when it came, wasn't a sudden crash, but a gradual deflation. 1853 saw gold production fall for the first time. Prices for goods and services began declining as competition increased and demand decreased. Businesses failed, unable to adapt to the new reality. Population growth slowed and then reversed as more people left California than arrived. The boom was over, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding decline that would continue for years. The social consequences of the bust were significant. Men who'd built their identities around being successful miners or California pioneers had to confront failure. Some became bitter and violent, lashing out at convenient scapegoats like Chinese immigrants or Native Americans. Others retreated into alcoholism or other forms of self-destruction. Some found new paths forward, transitioning into different work or leaving California entirely. But there was a widespread sense of disillusionment and lost dreams. The economic consequences were also substantial. The speculative fever that had driven investment into California cooled dramatically. Mining companies that had been formed to exploit supposedly rich claims went bankrupt when those claims proved barren. Real estate developments that had been planned for booming cities were abandoned as population declined. Banks failed. Businesses closed. It was a classic economic bust following a classic economic boom, and it hurt a lot of people. But California itself survived and eventually thrived, though not because of gold mining. The state's real wealth turned out to be its agriculture, its harbors, its climate, its position on the Pacific coast. Gold had brought people to California and had jump-started its economy, but it was these other factors that sustained it. The gold rush had been a catalyst, albeit a destructive and chaotic one, for California's development. James and Elizabeth weathered the bust successfully. Their diversified businesses and conservative financial management protected them from the worst effects. They even managed to expand during the downturn, buying out failing competitors at reduced prices. By 1855, when the gold rush was clearly over and California was transitioning to a more normal economy, they were well positioned as established business owners serving a stabilizing community. Looking back on his 7 years in California, James had complex feelings. He'd survived and even prospered, which was more than most gold rush participants could say. He'd witnessed extraordinary events and been part of a massive historical movement. But he'd also seen terrible things: suffering, violence, injustice, environmental destruction. The gold rush had revealed both the best and worst of human nature, often in the same person or situation. The parallel to later speculative bubbles was clear to James even then, though he didn't have the language to fully articulate it. The gold rush had exhibited all the classic characteristics: irrational exuberance, hype exceeding reality, easy money attracting masses of people, fraud and scams proliferating, environmental and social costs being ignored, then inevitable bust when reality couldn't sustain the inflated expectations. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout American history, from railroad speculation to the stock market crash of 1929 to the dot-com bubble to the housing crisis. But James also recognized that the gold rush, despite its failures and tragedies, had accomplished something. It had populated California, established cities and infrastructure, connected the Pacific coast to the rest of America, created opportunities for at least some people to improve their circumstances. It was messy and brutal and often unjust, but it had been transformative. Whether that transformation was worth the costs was a question James couldn't definitively answer. He thought often about Margaret and their son, buried under that oak tree back in Ohio. Had he honored their memory by coming to California? Had he built something they would have been proud of? Or had he just run away from grief and loss, chasing a false dream across the continent? These questions haunted him in quiet moments, though he never spoke of them to anyone, not even Elizabeth. Thomas Wu had his own complicated relationship with California. He'd achieved his goal of establishing a successful business, but he'd done so in a society that actively discriminated against him and his people. The Chinese population in California continued to grow through the 1850s and beyond, facing increasing hostility that would culminate in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Thomas's children and grandchildren would grow up as Americans, but would always be treated as foreigners because of their appearance. The California dream for Chinese immigrants was real but circumscribed, limited by racism that persisted long after the gold rush ended. For native Californians, the gold rush had been unmitigated catastrophe. Their traditional societies were destroyed, their population decimated, their lands stolen. There was no redeeming aspect to their experience of this period. They'd been in the way of American expansion and had been crushed without mercy or compensation. Their perspective on the gold rush was genocide, plain and simple, though mainstream American history would take over a century to begin acknowledging this reality. For women in California, the gold rush had created a strange mixture of opportunity and exploitation. Some women, like Elizabeth, had used the circumstances to build independent lives and accumulate wealth that would have been impossible back east. But many others had been victimized by the overwhelmingly male society, forced into prostitution or abusive marriages, dying young from disease or violence. The opportunities were real, but so were the dangers. For African Americans, California had offered a chance to escape slavery and live in a free state. But freedom in California was still constrained by racism. While slavery was illegal, discrimination was not. Black miners and business people faced hostility and legal restrictions, though perhaps less severe than what they would have encountered in the South. California was supposed to be a place where anyone could make it regardless of background, but that promise was only partially fulfilled. The environmental legacy of the gold rush was the least understood at the time, but perhaps the most enduring. The hydraulic mining, mercury use, deforestation, and habitat destruction had permanently altered California's landscape. Rivers that had run clear for millennia were clogged with sediment. Mercury contamination persisted in soils and waterways. Entire ecosystems were destroyed. It would take decades or longer for some of these wounds to heal, and some never would. The economic legacy was mixed. California had been rapidly integrated into the American economy, providing gold that helped finance national expansion and development. San Francisco had become a major city and economic hub. But the boom and bust cycle had left scars. Many individuals had been ruined financially. Capital had been misallocated into mining operations that ultimately failed. The state's economy had to diversify and stabilize after the initial gold frenzy. The cultural legacy was perhaps the most powerful and enduring. The California gold rush became part of American mythology, a story told and retold about manifest destiny, opportunity, and the frontier spirit. The 49ers were celebrated as pioneers and adventurers. The hardships were acknowledged but romanticized. The injustices and failures were downplayed or forgotten. What emerged was a narrative of American exceptionalism and optimism that ignored much of the actual history. This mythology would influence American culture profoundly. The California gold rush established templates and expectations that would shape later development. The idea that the West was a place for reinvention, that nature existed to be exploited, that opportunity was limitless if you were willing to take risks, that success was determined by individual effort rather than structural factors. These ideas became embedded in American consciousness and continue to influence policy and culture today. The parallels to Silicon Valley and the tech industry are striking and probably not coincidental. The Bay Area, that would later become the center of the tech revolution, was built on gold rush foundations. The venture capital model that funds tech startups echoes the speculative investments that funded mining operations. The willingness to tolerate repeated failures in pursuit of one massive success is the same psychology that drove miners to keep prospecting despite odds. The culture of disruption and creative destruction in tech has its roots in the gold rush mentality. Even the specific excesses and problems mirror each other. The environmental damage from tech manufacturing and e-waste recalls the environmental devastation of hydraulic mining. The exploitation of workers in tech supply chains reflects the exploitation of immigrant miners. The housing crisis in San Francisco, driven by tech wealth, recalls the real estate speculation of the gold rush era. The hype and overpromising of tech products mirrors the exaggerated newspaper accounts of gold discoveries. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. By 1855, James had come to understand California for what it was. Not a paradise or a hell, but a place. A complicated place with opportunities and challenges, successes and failures, hopes and disappointments. The gold rush had been a transformative experience for him personally and for the state collectively, but it hadn't been the simple story of adventure and fortune that the mythology suggested. He'd arrived in California as a desperate man fleeing failure and grief. He'd thrown himself into mining with naive hope and had been quickly disabused of his illusions. He'd pivoted to service work and then to small business ownership, finding a path to modest prosperity through pragmatism rather than speculation. He'd witnessed extraordinary events, met remarkable people, and seen both the best and worst of human nature. He'd married again, found some measure of happiness with Elizabeth, and built a life that was sustainable, if not spectacular. Was it worth it? Had the journey across the plains, the years of hard work, the things he'd witnessed and sometimes participated in, been justified by what he'd achieved? James wrestled with this question frequently. On one level, yes, he was materially better off than he'd been in Ohio. He'd survived when many hadn't. He'd built something substantial. But on another level, the costs had been high. The years of his life spent in brutal labor, the moral compromises he'd made, the suffering he'd witnessed without preventing. Thomas had similar ambivalence. He'd achieved his goal of establishing a business and had brought family members to California, helping them build new lives. But he'd also experienced discrimination and violence, had seen friends killed or driven away, had to constantly navigate a society that viewed him as alien and threatening. His success was real, but so was the injustice he'd endured. California had given him opportunities, but had also taken a toll. Elizabeth was perhaps the most pragmatic about it all. She'd come to California out of necessity, had survived circumstances that killed her husband, had built a successful business through hard work and intelligence. She didn't romanticize the experience or dwell on what might have been. California had been a place where she could survive and eventually thrive, and that was enough. She didn't need it to be more than that. The conversations among the three of them, sitting on the porch of one of the way stations on warm summer evenings, often turned to the question of legacy. What would the gold rush mean in the long run? How would people remember this period? Would they understand the reality, or would they buy into the mythology? James suspected the mythology would win, as it usually did. People preferred stories of adventure and fortune to stories of hard work, failure, and moral compromise. The gold rush would be remembered as an exciting chapter in American expansion, with the 49ers as heroes blazing trails westward. The suffering, the violence, the environmental destruction, the displacement of native peoples would be footnotes if mentioned at all. He was right, of course. For well over a century, the California gold rush was taught in schools as a positive story of American ingenuity and opportunity. Children learned about brave pioneers heading west to seek their fortunes. Adults consumed novels and movies that portrayed the era in romantic terms. The ugly realities were largely forgotten or downplayed. It took decades of revisionist history to begin presenting a more complete and honest picture. But even that revisionist history could miss important nuances. The gold rush wasn't simply bad or good, it was complex. Some people did strike it rich and build successful lives. Some genuine opportunities did exist, particularly for those providing services rather than mining. California did develop rapidly and become an important state. These facts didn't negate the suffering and injustice, but they also couldn't be dismissed. As 1855 turned to 56 and beyond, California continued evolving. The mining industry consolidated further, with major companies like the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company conducting massive hydraulic operations. Agriculture expanded dramatically, with California becoming a major producer of wheat, fruits, and vegetables. San Francisco grew into a sophisticated city with culture, finance, and industry. The state attracted new waves of immigrants, Irish fleeing famine, Germans seeking opportunity, Chinese continuing to arrive despite discrimination. James and Elizabeth expanded their businesses steadily. They opened more way stations, increased their agricultural operations, and eventually opened a proper hotel in Sacramento. They had children, though only 2 survived to adulthood, infant mortality being high even with California's improving conditions. They became established members of California society, respected business owners who'd weathered the gold rush and built something lasting. Thomas Wu continued running his general store and expanded into importing goods from China. He became a leader in Sacramento's growing Chinese community, helping new immigrants navigate the challenges they faced. He dealt with ongoing discrimination but persisted, building a business that would sustain his family for generations. His story was typical of Chinese Californians: success, despite obstacles, building community in the face of hostility, maintaining cultural identity while adapting to American society. The gold rush miners themselves, those who'd actually done the prospecting and panning, had mostly disappeared from California by the late 1850s. Some had died, victims of disease, accident, or violence. Many had given up and returned home, poorer than when they'd arrived. Others had transitioned into different work, becoming farmers, laborers, businessmen, or employees of mining companies. A stubborn few continued prospecting independently, but they were anachronisms, clinging to a dream that was effectively dead. The truly successful people from the gold rush era were those who'd provided services to miners or who'd invested in California's development. Levi Strauss, who'd sold durable work pants to miners, built a fortune that turned into a global company. Sam Brannan, who'd bought up all the mining equipment in San Francisco before news of the gold discovery spread widely, became California's first millionaire. Henry Wells and William Fargo, who'd provided banking and express services to miners, founded an institution that still exists. These men, and others like them, had understood the real opportunity. In California wasn't extracting gold, but facilitating and profiting from those who tried. This pattern repeated in every subsequent gold rush. In Nevada, in the 1860s, in Colorado, in South Dakota, in Alaska at the turn of the century, and it repeated in every subsequent economic bubble. The people who get rich during speculative manias are usually not the ones chasing the core asset. whether gold or tech stocks, or houses or cryptocurrencies. They're the ones selling shovels to prospectors, providing services to investors, facilitating the speculation itself. James had stumbled into this realization partly by necessity and partly by observation. His failed attempt at mining had taught him that the mythology was wrong. The real opportunity was in serving the miners, not joining them. This lesson served him well, not just during the gold rush, but throughout his life. When new opportunities arose, he evaluated them skeptically, looking for the sustainable business model rather than the quick fortune. By the time James died in 1887, California bore little resemblance to the chaotic mining camps of his early years. It was a developed state with cities, farms, industries, universities, and culture. The gold mining industry still existed, but was a fraction of the economy. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, had connected California firmly to the rest of the nation. The state was attracting people for reasons beyond mineral wealth: climate, agriculture, Pacific trade, opportunity. James's obituary in the Sacramento newspaper described him as a pioneer and successful businessman, a 49er who'd helped build California. It mentioned his way stations, his hotel, his farm, his family. It didn't mention the failed mining attempts, the moral compromises, the suffering he'd witnessed. It presented a sanitized version of his life that fit the narrative people wanted to believe about the gold rush era. His children inherited his businesses and continued building on what he'd started. They considered themselves Californians, not transplanted Ohioans. California was their home, their identity, their future. This transformation from temporary mining camp to permanent home had occurred for thousands of families, and it represented the gold rush's real legacy, not the gold that was extracted, but the state that was built. Thomas Wu died in 1892, passing his business to his sons who continued operating it for decades. His obituary in the Chinese language newspaper was more honest about the challenges he'd faced, discussing the discrimination and violence that had defined Chinese experience in California. But it also celebrated his success and resilience, holding him up as an example for the community. His legacy was complicated by California's ongoing mistreatment of its Chinese population, culminating in the Exclusion Act that wouldn't be repealed until 1943. Elizabeth outlived both men, dying in 1902 at the age of 78. She'd seen California transform from mining camps to a modern state. She'd witnessed Spanish-American war veterans returning through San Francisco, the city rebuilt after yet another devastating fire, the beginning of the Progressive era's reforms. Her life had spanned an extraordinary period of change, and she'd been an active participant in California's development. The California gold rush officially ended with the exhaustion of easily accessible deposits in the late 1850s, but its impacts echoed for generations. The state that emerged was shaped fundamentally by those chaotic years. The culture of entrepreneurship and risk-taking, the willingness to upend established orders, the focus on individual opportunity over collective stability, the environmental exploitation, the racial tensions, all had roots in the gold rush period. California became the model for American development moving forward. The patterns established during the gold rush replayed across the West as settlement expanded. Boom and bust cycles became normal. Speculation was encouraged. Environmental concerns were ignored. Indigenous peoples were displaced. Racial hierarchies were maintained while opportunity rhetoric was deployed. This was the California model, and it spread. When the tech industry emerged in Silicon Valley a century later, It inherited these patterns and assumptions. The culture of rapid wealth creation, of building companies to flip rather than sustain, of accepting enormous failure rates in pursuit of occasional massive successes, of emphasizing individual brilliance over collective action, all echoed gold rush mentalities. The language even paralleled, prospecting for opportunities, striking it rich, panning for winners, gold mines of data. The parallels extended to the social consequences. The tech boom displaced existing communities as housing prices skyrocketed. Much like the gold rush had displaced native peoples, it created stark inequality between successful entrepreneurs and everyone else. Much like the gold rush had created a small class of the wealthy, while leaving most participants struggling, it generated environmental concerns from e-waste and energy consumption, echoing the mercury contamination and hydraulic destruction of the gold rush. It attracted global migration, creating demographic change and cultural tension similar to the gold rush era. Understanding the California gold rush as the first major American tech bubble provides insight into both historical and contemporary phenomena. It reveals that human nature and economic dynamics haven't fundamentally changed. The same drives that sent men rushing to California in 1849 propel entrepreneurs launching startups today. The same speculative fever that inflated gold mining stocks inflates cryptocurrency valuations. The same gap between mythology and reality that defined the gold rush defines modern tech narratives. But understanding the gold rush also reveals possibilities for learning from history. The bust that followed the boom taught lessons about sustainability, about the difference between wealth creation and wealth extraction, about the costs of ignoring environmental and social consequences. California ultimately thrived not because of gold mining, but because people built sustainable industries, agriculture, manufacturing, trade, services, technology. The state succeeded when it moved beyond extraction to creation. This lesson applies to contemporary bubbles. The dot-com boom eventually gave way to viable internet companies that created genuine value. The cryptocurrency frenzy will presumably lead to some useful applications of blockchain technology, while most coins become worthless. The key is distinguishing between speculative mania and real opportunity, between extraction and creation, between short-term gains and long-term sustainability. James Hartford, if he could have seen California in the 21st century, would have recognized both the continuity and the change. The fundamental pattern of boom and bust, of hype and reality, of winners and losers, would be familiar. But the scale of development, the sophistication of technology, the complexity of society would be astonishing. California had become something beyond what any 49er could have imagined, built on the foundation they'd laid, but transcending it. The gold rush was simultaneously less romantic and more significant than its mythology suggested. It wasn't a simple story of adventure and fortune. It was a complex chapter of American history involving suffering, injustice, environmental destruction, and social upheaval alongside genuine opportunity and remarkable individual achievement. Understanding it fully requires holding these contradictions together, acknowledging both the harms and the benefits, the failures and the successes. For the miners who participated, for people like James and Thomas and Elizabeth, the gold rush was intensely personal. It was their lives, their hopes, their struggles. They didn't have the luxury of historical perspective or the ability to see how their experiences fit into larger patterns. They were just trying to survive, to make something of themselves, to find opportunity in chaos. That their individual stories became part of a massive historical movement was almost incidental. But those individual stories mattered. The aggregate of millions of personal decisions, individual hopes, private tragedies, and small successes created the California Gold Rush and shaped its legacy. Understanding the era requires zooming in to see those personal experiences, while also zooming out to see the larger patterns and consequences. Both perspectives are necessary for a complete picture. The daily life during the California Gold Rush was neither the romantic adventure of popular imagination nor the unrelenting misery of pure dystopia. It was hard, often brutal work in difficult conditions, relieved by moments of hope, community, and even joy. It was experiencing discrimination and injustice while also witnessing acts of kindness and solidarity. It was getting sick and possibly dying, but also possibly recovering and persevering. It was failing to strike it rich, but maybe building something sustainable anyway. For most participants, the gold rush didn't deliver on its promised rewards. They didn't get rich. They didn't achieve the independence and opportunity they'd been promised. But many found something else. They survived. They adapted. They built lives in a new place. They became part of a story larger than themselves. Whether this was adequate compensation for what they'd invested and endured was a question each person had to answer individually. The California Gold Rush was America's first great tech bubble, complete with irrational exuberance, collective delusion, boom and bust, winners and losers, lasting infrastructure, and complicated legacies. Understanding it as such provides insight into human nature, economic dynamics, and historical patterns that remain relevant today. The technologies change, the specific circumstances differ, but the fundamental dynamics persist. People continue to chase dreams of easy wealth, continue to buy into hype, continue to ignore warning signs, continue to learn the hard way that sustainable success requires something more than speculation. But people also continue to build, to create, to persevere through difficulties, to find opportunity in chaos, to establish communities in challenging circumstances. The Gold Rush participants who succeeded weren't necessarily the luckiest or most talented. They were often the most adaptable, the most willing to pivot when their initial plans failed, the most capable of seeing reality clearly rather than through the lens of mythology. These traits remain valuable in any era, any bubble, any period of rapid change. James Hartford's story, multiplied by tens of thousands of similar stories, created California. His daily life of hard work, moral compromise, pragmatic adaptation, personal loss, and modest success was typical of the Gold Rush experience. He wasn't a hero of mythology or a victim of tragedy. He was an ordinary person caught up in extraordinary circumstances, doing his best to navigate challenges he barely understood. His legacy was not great wealth or fame, but survival, adaptation, and the foundation for future generations to build on. This is perhaps the truest lesson of the California Gold Rush, that most people won't strike it rich, but they might still find a way forward. That the mythology will always exceed the reality, but reality is what you have to deal with. That every bubble bursts eventually, but life continues afterward. That the real gold isn't in the streams, but in what you build with your own hands, day by day, year by year, despite disappointments and setbacks. James understood this by the end of his life, though it took years of hard experience to learn it. The California Gold Rush of 1848 to 55 was many things: a migration, a genocide, an environmental catastrophe, an economic bubble, a cultural phenomenon, a transformative historical event. It was all of these simultaneously, and understanding it requires holding these different aspects together without trying to resolve them into a simple narrative. History is complicated, and the gold rush was especially so. For people living through it, like James and Elizabeth and Thomas, the complexity was experienced day by day. They didn't have the luxury of knowing how the story would end. They made decisions based on incomplete information, hoping for the best, fearing the worst, usually ending up somewhere in between. Their daily lives were shaped by larger forces they barely understood: global economic trends, political decisions, social movements, technological changes. But they lived those lives one day at a time, and that's ultimately what history is: the accumulation of individual days and choices that add up to movements and eras. The daily life during the California gold rush was wake up before dawn, work until your body ached, go to sleep hoping tomorrow would be better. It was dealing with constant uncertainty about money, health, safety, and future. It was witnessing injustice and sometimes participating in it. It was experiencing both the best and worst of humanity in compressed time frame and confined spaces. It was surviving, adapting, and occasionally thriving in circumstances that tested everyone who participated. And it was, whether participants realized it or not, being part of the first great American tech bubble, establishing patterns and dynamics that would replay throughout the nation's history up to the present day. The technologies changed from gold pans to computers, from hydraulic monitors to venture capital. But the fundamental human drives and economic dynamics remained surprisingly constant. Understanding this continuity helps make sense of both past and present, providing perspective on current bubbles and manias by revealing that we've been here before, even if the specific details differ. The California gold rush ended over a century and a half ago, but its lessons remain relevant. The cycle continues today in new forms, with new technologies and new promised lands, but the same human psychology driving people towards speculation and away from sustainable building. Study the patterns carefully. Recognize when hype exceeds reality. Understand that the people selling shovels usually profit more than the people digging for gold. Know that most bubbles end with more losers than winners, no matter how many success stories are celebrated. Learn from James Hartford's journey from naive prospector to pragmatic service provider, from chasing quick riches to building something lasting. The daily life of the gold rush, stripped of romance and mythology, was mostly about ordinary people doing extraordinary things for ordinary reasons. They woke up each morning facing enormous challenges and somehow kept going. They made mistakes and learned from them, or didn't and paid the price. They treated some people with compassion and others with cruelty. They built businesses and communities even as they exploited resources and displaced populations. They were fully human, neither heroes nor villains, just people trying to make their way through a transformative moment in history. And that, ultimately, is what daily life always is. People navigating their immediate circumstances as best they can, shaped by forces larger than themselves, but still exercising agency in small and large ways. The California gold rush was a historical moment when those forces and circumstances were unusually dramatic and consequential, creating a crucible that tested everyone who participated. Understanding how ordinary people navigated that crucible, what choices they made and why, what succeeded and what failed, provides not just historical knowledge, but practical wisdom for navigating our own volatile times. The gold that James Hartford and millions like him sought in California's streams proved elusive for most. But in searching for it, in adapting when that search failed, in building businesses and communities and lives in a strange new place, they created something more valuable and lasting than any individual fortune. They created California itself, with all its complexity, contradiction, opportunity, and cost. That creation, built day by day through ordinary choices in extraordinary circumstances, remains the true legacy of the gold rush era and the real lesson for anyone seeking to understand daily life during America's first great tech bubble.